Seasonal festivals of the Celts. This is the last of the series. Much of what I'm going to be talking about is probably familiar to anybody who's got any familiarity with or practices in any of the modern neo-pagan spiritual traditions. Because, as widely known, neo-paganism in general, particularly Wicca, adopted what are basically Irish names for some of the 8 commonly celebrated fire festivals, high days, Sabbats, all those. You'll see all those terms used to refer to them. The so-called Wheel of the Year, the eightfold Wheel of the Year, involves the 2 solstices, the 2 solar equinoxes, and then 4 other occasions midway between those solar events, which are generally, though not exclusively, referred to by names that are ultimately Irish and even deeper in Celtic linguistic history. So most of what I'll be talking about during this is some of the elements associated with those festivals, both historical and to a lesser degree contemporary. But first I'm going to give just a little bit of context for the relationship between the year, the cycle of the year, and the culture of the ancient Celtic societies. First thing that's important to note is, as I think I've said before, traditional, particularly pre-Christian Celtic culture was agricultural, agrarian, pastoral, and in particular tended to be non-urban, even into relatively recent times. Roman culture, the Roman imperial culture, places that were heavily touched by the hand of Rome, tended to develop administrative centers, capital cities, provincial capitals, that sort of thing. There was a sort of a network, an administrative network that helped to govern and speed money and information and imperial decrees and so forth back and forth to the farthest reaches of the empire. The situation outside the Roman Empire in places like Ireland and Scotland is quite different. And as I've suggested before, the culture tended to be focused more on family groupings and extended kin groupings. However, you still had to conduct commerce of one sort or another. And so in all of these sort of agricultural areas, pastoral areas, non-urban, that is to say, I guess, rural areas of the Celtic world, there would be gatherings, what you could, I think, fairly call, no pun intended, fairs. The word in Irish for the larger of these periodic gatherings is Onach, O-E-N-A-C-H. In modern, that's Old Irish actually, in modern Irish it's Enoch, A-E-N-A-C-H. That word in Irish specifically refers to, as I said a second ago, the largest of sort of periodic gatherings of a community. Specifically, to refer back to something I discussed in a previous talk, an Onach would be a gathering of the Tua, or roughly the sort of provincial nation, if you will. So the gathering of many tribes, in a sense. If you have the smaller, more local clan groupings of the Finna and the Jerab Finna, which I've talked about previously, that all would go to comprise the larger province-sized grouping of the Tua, then the Onach was the gathering of all of those local Finna or Jerab Finna, the smaller units. A lot of different kinds of business would be transacted at these regional gatherings, both the larger ones, sort of provincial scale ones, and more local occasions. Everything from agricultural trade to the contracting of marriages, the celebrating of marriages. You would find at different parts of the year that betrothals would happen, actual marriages would happen, and this lasts down into the historic record, into more recent times. So that's the first thing to sort of bear in mind as context, that traditional pre-Christian Celtic society was very much attuned to annual cycles, to community festivals, if you will, to ingathering, if you will, the coming together of people who were separated in space to one place. We have the names of some of the major UNECs, the provincial fairs, UNEC Talchin, UNEC Carmen, UNEC Macha, UNEC Cui, and UNEC Teltje. Of these, probably the most familiar, and I'm going to come back to it, is the UNEC Talchin, which survives in more recent Irish history as the fair at Teltown, which is associated with the Festival of Lunasa, which I'll talk more towards the end of the discussion. We don't always know what dates or even really what places these were held at. The names survive, but not the details. However, they were major occasions. They were very much central to the life of the people, of the culture, the society, scattered though it might be. And they are, as I say, a central feature of Celtic culture. I'm going to relate that sense of sort of ingathering at annual festivals to the religious traditions in a bit here. But I'm going to sort of jump over to that thread for a second and sort of work my way back and tie them together. In the Celtic lands, there are a lot of sacred sites. Many of them are hilltops. This is true not just in Ireland, but also in Scotland and in Wales. There are sacred mountains in Wales, like Mount Snowdon. And we have folk tradition that records the lighting of major ceremonial bonfires on the hilltops, on some of these sacred hilltops. A couple of these hills, the Hill of Tara, the Hill of Ishnak, were associated with the center of the land. They were regarded in one tradition or another as being, if you will, the navel, the very center of Ireland. We have one important suggestion, which I'm going to come back to, of the lighting of an important ritual fire on the Hill of Tara, which was the seat of the High King, that even survives to us in Christian lore, in the life of St. Patrick. So there's a couple things to note there. First of all, the existence of ceremonial sites that tells us that the religious practices of the ancient Celts weren't just private, they weren't just hearth-based, they weren't just based in the home and the family, but that there were community gatherings. And that fire was involved. Now we know, as I've indicated previously, that there are major, obviously there were major religious observances associated with sacred springs and lakes, sacrificial shafts, offering sites of that nature. So the religious practices, community ceremonies weren't just oriented around fire, but it is important to bear in mind that there is plenty of evidence that suggests that fire was a major sort of unifying ritual element for community ceremonies and celebrations. What's interesting is that we find in some of the folklore, which survives down into pretty recent times, the suggestion that from the central location, from the important sacred site, from the hilltop, the fires of the individual hearths of the homes around the nation, around the island of Ireland, just stick with Ireland here for a bit, would be relit ceremonially at one of these major festival occasions. So there is a sense in which, again, the dispersed population of the island is still somehow connected through this thread of unified hearths, that somehow all the hearths are partaking of a ritually kindled central fire. so that everybody, in a certain sense, as their hearth is lit and stays lit in their home, is connected to everyone else, at least in their region, and if the folklore is correct, across the island of Ireland entirely, by having rekindled their hearth fire in their home from one central ritually important fire that was kindled at an important moment in the year. So you can see, in a certain sense, if that's how the people might have conceived of themselves, as all being part of one big spiritually interconnected web that's made very, very present by the existence of this ritually rekindled hearth fire in their home that they tend on a daily basis, that coming together at these eunuchs and other smaller fairs, these periodic gatherings in, sort of reinforce and draw on and connect with the way the community worship was practiced, that the two things were interdependent, they mutually reinforced each other, and they were, again, sort of part and parcel of the existence of, I should say, probably the very fabric of the society. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus primarily on these four main so-called fire festivals, what were in Irish tradition known as quarter days, and in neo-pagan tradition, it's worth noting, quarter days as a phrase is usually associated with the solstices and equinoxes, but those were actually referred to as the crooked quarters in Celtic tradition. The Irish word that as a blanket refers to the solstices and equinoxes, to the dates halfway between their fire festivals, were known as the crooked quarters. And the quarter days, per se, were the four main fire festivals. So it's interesting, at least parenthetically, that in modern paganism, that terminology has kind of gotten switched. So when people are referring to some of these 8 Sabbats, these 8 high days, these 8 major festivals, by their original Celtic names, they may be referring to them in a manner that the Irish would take exception to. The Celts, we know, had elaborate calendar customs. And so before talking about individual holidays, I want to just give a brief sketch of what we think we know about the way the Celts reckoned time. A major source for this, or for our understanding of this anyway, is an important archaeological artifact, the so-called Coligny calendar, that's Coligny, which was found in France in the late 19th century. It's a fragmentary, not sure if it's bronze or copper, I think it's bronze, tablets, the remnants of a tablet, which was clearly a calendar. It's sort of set up in tabular format, columns of references to dates. And what it represents, as best people can determine after reconstructing it, is both an annual and multi-annual cycle of time. It basically sketches out a 30-year cycle of time, which would recur sort of ad infinitum. It sets forth a lunar reckoning of the year with, I think it's 354 days. But it does also reconcile that with the 365-day solar calendar by every so often adding an extra month. What's interesting about this, or at least one of the things that's interesting about the Coligny calendar, is that it does reinforce a widely held conception that the Celts divided things into dark and light halves. The calendar does show a sort of dark and light half of the year, and the months are divided into groupings of days which are either the abbreviations on the calendar are MAT or ANM. And MAT is a pretty common Celtic root word. You find it in the modern Irish word ma, M-A-I-T-H, which means good. And that A-N can mean not, can be a negation. So the notion is that those stood for Mot and Anmat, in a sense, auspicious and inauspicious dates. So there was some notion that, maybe a little bit inscrutable to us moderns, not having any sort of supporting documentation for how to use this calendar, but it appears that they reckoned the year as going through periodic cycles of auspicious and inauspicious blocks of time. And then within that, it appears that the day begins at sunset, that the days were reckoned from sunset to sunset, not midnight to midnight, as we've become accustomed to. And it's probably worth sort of reflecting on whether there's anything meaningful to an understanding of the day as beginning with nightfall as opposed to beginning with dawn. The year begins with the onset of winter, it appears, with the month that is still known in Irish as Mina Samhain, the month of Samhain. That's the beginning month of the year, and it was the beginning month of the year in this old Gaulish calendar, the Cluny calendar. So things seem to begin with the onset of darkness, that it's out of, maybe that implies in some sense that it's out of chaos, order appears, maybe it means just that you have to have light dawning out of dark. Maybe we'll never know exactly what that means, but it seems to be a pretty common way of reckoning time, a way of understanding the passage of time for Celtic cultures. Now, in the Cluny calendar, there are references to some of the so-called fire festivals, these quarter days. And it's an important piece of evidence, of archaeological evidence in that regard, because it supports references we find in mythology and folklore and folk tradition to these being important festivals. And it leads us to believe that these are really deeply rooted in Celtic culture, because they're not only referenced in the more recent Irish manuscript evidence, they're not just referenced in, say, Scottish folklore, but we find these references even in this ancient 1st century of the current era bronze calendar from Gaul on the continent. We find references to Samhain, to Beltane, and to Lunasa, all of which I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly, which is 3 out of the 4 festivals for which we have reference, the 4th being Imbolc, or Imbolc. And if that, in turn, I think is important, because if there are, if you will, pan-Celtic holidays, pan-Celtic festivals that are important not just all the way over in, say, the west of Ireland, but also on the continent in Gaul, then it makes it reasonable to assume that there may be other pan-Celtic aspects of spirituality and culture. So that when people speculate about whether there are certain gods or goddesses, for example, the most obvious being the god Lu, who we find reference to both in Ireland and on the continent and elsewhere, it makes it more reasonable to think that these are individual deities that survive from deeper in Celtic history, that they are, in a sense, as I say, pan-Celtic, that they have survived and maybe just altered their form as the Celtic language and culture sort of spread over much of Western Europe. So let me talk now about these fire festivals, these occasions whose names have been picked up by modern paganism and spread pretty broadly as a result. I think it's probably fair to say that outside of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, had particularly the Wiccan religion not picked up these names, they probably would be virtually unknown, other than in a few counties here and there in the Celtic-speaking lands. These names would be incredibly obscure. But as a result of their appropriation by modern pagan religions, they've become relatively familiar, at least in certain quarters. So to start with the festival that would begin the year, at least as far as we can tell, we'll talk a little bit about Samhain. Uh, the MH is a W sound. It can also be a V. Samhain is the usual spelling. You'll see it spelled in the Old Irish spelling of Samain. And there are other spellings as well, depending on whether you're using an anglicized spelling, whether it's a Scottish, I should say Scots Gaelic spelling, or an Irish spelling. Samhain, we associate with Halloween. It's the Feast of All Hallows, All Saints in the Catholic Church. There is a Welsh name for it, Calan Gaeaf. That's Calan Gaeaf. The use of the word Calan, Calan, to name some of these occasions is interesting and I suppose important because that's a borrowing from Latin. It's a borrowing from the Romans. The first of the month in Roman parlance is the calends, Calends. Just as the middle of the month, for those of you who know the play Julius Caesar, is the Ides of the month. So the calends is the beginning, the Ides is the middle. And so the Welsh, who were part of the province of Britannia, part of the Roman Empire, did pick up that word calends, and it is used in these the names for these festivals, at least where we have them. The derivation of the word Samhain is a little uncertain, but in general, it's felt that it refers to the end of the summer. Saura in Irish refers to summer, just as Givra refers to winter. Givra has associations with snow, but just why Samhain refers to summer is less clear. There is a reference in the Cluny calendar to Trinux Dian Simonii, which I've seen translated as meaning 3 nights of the end of summer. So again, we see at least some token reference to this festival, or at least to the term for summer's end, in the Gaulish calendar as well as in the Irish usage that survives down to the present day. Samhain seems to be, and certainly modern paganism has picked up this association and amplified it, seems to be a passage from one year to the other, and it is often referred to as the Celtic New Year. That may be overstating things a little bit, but it definitely has associations with the turning of the year, particularly if we do accept the notion that the Celts saw the year as beginning with the dark half of the year, because Samhain is unquestionably the beginning of the dark half of the year. There seems to be quite a bit of association with the dead. There are superstitions, not just in Ireland but elsewhere, that have to do with the dead at Samhain. I think I've read of a superstition in Wales, if I'm remembering it correctly, where one should not look back over one's shoulder when walking down the road on Samhain, on Halloween. You're likely to be followed by the dead, and you don't want to turn around and see that. In one famous myth, Tara, which, as I said earlier, is one of the sacred centers, one of the sacred hills of Ireland, it was the seat of the High Kings, was beset for many years by a monstrous figure, Allen, Aillen, who appeared on Samhain, was eventually vanquished by the great hero Finn McCool. So this was a sort of an eruption of a, if you will, demonic figure, monstrous otherworldly figure into the human world at this point in time. That's the sort of mythic reference that helps to fill out this picture of this as a time where, again, in the neo-pagan sensibility, the veil between the worlds is thin. Another significant mythological reference is to a mating of 2 of the most important deities of the Irish, of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the pantheon, if you will, of the Irish. The Dagda, or Daida. Either pronunciation is okay. You'll see it usually spelled D-A-G-D-A. That's an old Irish spelling of it, which is a word that just literally translates as the good God, as in the sense good in the sense of competent, effective, and the Morrigan, Morrigan, which literally translates as great queen. The mating of these two figures in one important myth, one of the major myths of the ancient Irish, of the pagan Irish, took place at Samhain, and that's often understood, or at least thought to refer to a notion that this great primal male figure and primal female figure would mate at the beginning of the year and perhaps in some sense give birth to the year or provide fertility, prosperity for the coming year. The literal sense of what the myth implies is perhaps obscure, but it's certainly suggestive that these two figures mate. In fact, she's astride a river while he's copulating with her. It's a fascinating image, and it's one that a lot of people, a lot of modern pagans are familiar with and reflect on and make use of in different ways. Both at Samhain and at another occasion, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, Beltane, which is 6 months later, there are arrivals, comings and goings of important races of beings, at least in the Irish lore. Battles might begin. These were clearly times that, in the consciousness of the Irish people, transitions would take place. Major upheavals in the social order could take place. Samhain would be a good time for a sort of Feast of Fools occasion, because social reversals could be understood to be appropriate and to take place at that time. So that's yet another theme that runs through the understanding of Samhain. It is a huge transitional point in the passage of time. It's, again, the beginning of one year, the ending of the other, and in a certain sense it is also the moment between those 2 years. In terms of actual practice, cultural institutions associated with Samhain, the ritual fire associated with Tara took place at that time. There is a hill within line of sight of Tara called Tlachtka, Tlachttga. In modern times, it's known as the Hill of Ward. And it was on that hill, so folklore tells us, that the ritual fire was lit. That ritual fire associated with the king at Tara was lit at that time. And supposedly from that fire you would relight the extinguished hearth fires of the other people in the land. This was also the time, getting sort of closer to home and into more prosaic terms, when decisions had to be made about how to get through the winter. Judgments had to be made about what resources you had, how much of the stock to kill, and how many to take in for the winter, to share the limited amount of indoor space that you had to get through the winter, so that you had enough food to get you through the winter, enough feed on hand to feed the stock that you were going to take in, and hopefully have enough animals left to breed as many animals as you would need for the summer months the following year. So it's a major decision-making time. It's a major ingathering time for local communities and for families. I recall a few years ago when I was in Limerick, there's a sort of a folk village museum outside Limerick by Bunratty Castle that has examples of different homes from down through the centuries in Ireland. And one of them had sort of a thatched cottage, like a one-room cottage. It had a loft at one end, big hearth at one end. And down the middle of it, running through the floor in the middle of this cottage, was a channel, like a little tiny little trench or gutter. And as you looked around the room, you understood that that was what was separating the half of the room where the cattle would have been, or perhaps the sheep or pigs, from where the people were. So this was in historic times, and probably was true before that as well. At this time of year, you were going inside with the animals. Maybe you might have an outbuilding for them, maybe not. But you were really living with them. You were so closely connected with them, and this was, as I say, the pivotal moment of the year where you had to start making decisions about how many of them you're going to be sharing your home with for the winter, so that you and they both will get through the entire next year. Moving forward 3 months to what's now the beginning of February, we get to the next festival, and it's the one that is the least well documented. And much of our understanding of it comes from Catholic tradition, from Catholic customs, probably as much as from what we think might be sort of pre-Christian customs. And that's Imbolc, also known as Imbolc or Imbolc. One Irish spelling is Oimealg. You don't see that spelling so much. Generally, you'll see Imbolc or Imbolc, Imbolc. It's also Candlemas in Christian tradition. And the Irish these days are more likely to know it by the name Láthla Bríd, which is 3 words, L-A, which is the word for day, Héile, which is a version of Féile, that's F-H-E-I-L-E in this case. The word Féile, F-E-I-L-E, if the word were to stand alone, refers to a festival. And Bride, B-R-I-D-E, refers to the saint Bridget, who was, we think, a guise for the pre-Christian goddess Bridget, or Bride. So this is the day of the festival or feast of Bridget. It's St. Bridget's feast day. And it's an important holiday. It's an important feast day in the Irish calendar and actually elsewhere in the Celtic world. But the pre-Christian word, Imbolc or Imbolc, probably derives from a word referring to lactation, to the animals coming into milk in preparation for birthing of their young. That's certainly the folk etymology that most people accept. There's another folk etymology that suggests in a bag, in the sense of in the belly, referring to pregnancy, one assumes. But the notion that it's related to lactation, coming into milk, is probably more likely to be the correct one. As I say, most of what we know about this festival really derives from Christian custom, but some of it reflects back to things that we're pretty secure in thinking were part of pagan tradition. The vast majority of the customs and associations around this festival are indeed associated with the Saint Bridget, and presumably, at least in most respects, also the pre-Christian goddess Bride. That name, Bridget, Brige, and some related goddess names like Brigantia, which is found in Britain, actually is a title, and it refers to something like Exalted One or High One. So anybody you know who's named Bridget, their name ultimately comes from a phrase that means Exalted One. She is, of the female saints, far and away the most important one in the Celtic lands, and absolutely one of the most beloved saints in Irish tradition. She has a fair number of associations with the home and with the hearth and with motherhood. If, as I suggested, the name of this, the pre-Christian name of her festival had to do with coming into milk, interestingly, Bridget is referred to in Christian lore as the midwife of Christ. So she has something to do with the mothering, the birthing, the midwifing of the sacred infant. But more than that, more than just this association in Christian folklore with motherhood and with helping to nurture and rear Jesus, Bridget has long been associated with the tending of the hearth fire generally, and specifically with the maintenance of a perpetual fire tended in her honor, particularly one tended at Kildare, which is still probably the locality most closely associated with her in Ireland. The Brigidine sisters, for many centuries it appears, tended a fire for Bridget. And the tradition was, so we're told, that for 19 days in turn the sisters would tend the fire, and then on the 20th day Bridget miraculously would tend the fire. That fire was put out during Renaissance times, when the Catholic Church and its customs were busy being suppressed by the English. And it's only been, I think, 10 years ago that a fire was relit in Kildare by the Brigidine order, and they're tending it now. I had the good fortune when I was in Kildare for Ambolic back in 2003 to take part in, there's a major celebration for Law Hale Bridge for Bridget's feast day that's very ecumenical, very interfaith, and the Brigidine sisters were there throughout the day with a candle and a lantern that had been lit from the fire, and that flame was made use of in a number of different contexts during the day. And they're very open about sharing that flame, not just with Catholics, but with anyone of any religious persuasion who wants to make use of it. Bridget is, as I say, seen as a pre-Christian goddess as well. She's referenced in quite a number of the Irish myths. I mentioned the Dagda or the Daida a few minutes ago, and Bridget Bridge is seen in the myths as being his daughter. The lore suggests that, and this comes back to the association with fire, that Bridget could be seen also as three sisters, all named Bridget. This is a common motif in Celtic mythology, to see goddesses as sort of three sisters, not as some people would think, a maiden, mother, and crone figure, but as three sisters essentially contemporary, or even triplets. But they would each perhaps have a different function. They might be seen in iconography as holding a different object. And in this case, the three Bridgets are seen as being responsible for or associated with or being matron of the skills of poetry, of smithcraft, and of healing. Smithcraft, it's pretty easy to see the association with fire, the forge fire. Poetry, poetic inspiration, as I've suggested previously, is incubatory, has to do with, if you will, a fire in the head. And there are associations in terms of healing also with incubation, with going into an incubatory state and being warmed. Also that the healthful balance of the constituent parts of the body has to do with three cauldrons, which want to be maintained in as upright position as possible, as full, upright, and warmed by internal heat, if you will, as possible. This is found in a manuscript called the Cauldron of Poesy. It's usually translated as that, which gives an insight into the way perhaps the Irish traditionally looked at health and, as I say, the constituents of the human body and soul. There are a number of customs associated with this festival in folk practice. One of the most interesting and probably most widely emulated by modern pagans, at least in recent times, is the processing of a brídeog, which is a word that literally means the young Bridget, which is an effigy, a doll that would be paraded perhaps home to home, brought before the hearth. There are any number of sort of seasonal processional customs like this. At St. Stephen's Day, which is around Christmas time, there's the procession of the wren, where a wren is taken around the village by the so-called wren boys who beg for coins to pay for the wren's funeral. So at Imbolc, at Lough Breach, there is a similar sort of processing of the Breejogue, this effigy that represents the young Bridget. Just in passing, the other, of course, major holiday that happens around this time is Groundhog Day. And I've read that, I didn't know this until recently, our Groundhog Day customs in North America do in fact come from Irish tradition, only there it was not the groundhog, it was the hedgehog, who could foretell whether we would have more winter or we're getting into spring. Moving another 3 months ahead, the next fire festival is Beltane. You'll see this also spelled a number of different ways, depending on whether you're looking at Old Irish, Modern Irish, or English. In English, it's Beltane, B-E-L-T-A-N-E. In Irish, Modern Irish, you'll see Bealtaine, which is B-E-A-L-T-A-I-N-E. You'll see it spelled without that first A. You'll see it spelled as B-E-L-T-A-I-N-E. And I guess there's a couple other regional spellings as well. In Welsh, it's Calan Mai, C-A-L-A-N-M-A-I, which, yeah, means the 1st of May. Or May Day, which is, of course, the other name that we know this occasion by. If Samhain was the beginning of the dark half of the year, Beltane is the beginning of summer, of the light half of the year. It's a reflection of Samhain in a sense. It's the other hinge point, major hinge point of the year. It's also known apparently by the term Cethawen, that's C-E-T-S-H-A-M-A-I-N, which essentially means the 1st of summer. Probably even more than Samhain, in the mythology, Beltane is the occasion for invasions by mythic races, the gods and others, and with other sorts of beginnings. And so even though we're accustomed to thinking, and with good reason, of Samhain as I said, the Celtic New Year, Beltane in certain sense is a very important festival of beginnings, and perhaps of auspicious beginnings. That the things, the beings that are coming into the land at this time are coming in a certain auspicious sense. I don't think that's universally true, but I think as a motif, as a theme, as something that you can associate with this festival, I think in general that's true. There was a ritual fire lit on the hill of Uisneach at this time. Uisneach is U-I-S-N-E-A-C-H. Uisneach is also regarded as a center point of the island of Ireland, and much more so than Tara, it actually literally is at the center of Ireland. Uisneach is it's pretty darn close to the geographic center of Ireland. It also happens to be a relatively high hill in the center of Ireland, which is in general a kind of depressed boggy area topographically. So that if you go up to the top of the hill of Uisneach, you actually do have a pretty commanding view for quite a number of counties around in all directions. There are some earthworks at the top of the hill of Uisneach that indicate that it was an important site and probably has been over the centuries. There's a phrase I read that I thought was an interesting image, that in terms of there being two kind of ritually important center hills in Ireland, that Tara and Uisneach were like, quote, 2 kidneys in a beast, 2 kidneys in one beast. The lore suggests, and this is in the mythology, that the first fire lit for Beltane on the top of Uisneach, which was actually even before the coming of the Tuatha Danann, the most famous of the Irish deities, burned for 7 years. And it established that custom down through history. Fire is important and has remained important at Beltane. and in terms of folk practice, people and cattle both could be purified for the summer months by passing, in some cases, between two bonfires that were lit at Beltane. Fire is used in various ways in folk practice in the Celtic lands to purify and to protect. There are places where, when the stock are going to be released into pasture, particularly into an enclosed field, you might process a torch around the perimeter of the field. Ostensibly, I think this is a custom from Scotland, although I think I've heard it's practiced or has been practiced in Ireland as well. Ostensibly, that's to keep the wolves out, as if the wolves would be literally kept away by a torch having been walked around a field. And it's worth noting that wolf in general tends to refer to kind of adversarial beings. It doesn't necessarily always refer to a literal wolf. It might have come to mean a literal wolf, but often the wolf is a stand-in for outsider beings who oppose the prosperity of people that are wanting to cross boundaries and come in and wreak havoc of one sort or another. Often warriors in a kind of destructive battle frenzy are associated with imagery that suggests the werewolf. So in any case, that sort of canine adversary, that image of the wolf that one is protecting the stock from, doesn't necessarily just mean protecting from a literal wolf. There's a notion that there is a kind of ritual component that's about sort of cleansing and protecting from unseen adversaries as well. And so if that's true of this notion of passing a blazing brand around for protection, so too passing people and cattle next to or between fires at Beltane would, one assumes, cleanse, purify, and protect them for the summer months. The summer months being the time when people in an agrarian pastoral society are going to be out in the field exposed to the elements and to predators and to raiding parties from other tribes, et cetera, et cetera. I've read that in Wales and Scotland, the bonfire for Beltane was to be lit by 9 men with 9 kinds of wood. I don't have a list of what kinds of wood those would be, but I think that's interesting. 3 is a very magical number for almost all Indo-European cultures, and so thrice 3 or 9 is 3 times as magical. Hawthorn, the thorn bush, is associated with this holiday. Hawthorn branches could be collected as love tokens at this time. This is a time of betrothals. Not necessarily, if I have my lore straight, a time for marriages. As I understand it, and I could be wrong, Lunasa, the 1st of August, is more associated with the actual contracting of marriages. But there absolutely are associations with betrothals and expressions of love at Beltane. The rowan tree also has associations with Beltane. Rowan crosses could be put up, nailed up for protection. There are associations with flowers and with a flower maiden, images of a woman made of flowers, a la the Welsh Bladuith, and dolls that could be used to honor the flower maiden. So there's associations with the beginning of the sort of greening or flowering of the year. There are associations with love. And most importantly, I think this is the recurring theme that's worth really hanging on to, this notion of protecting in the sense of purifying and preparing for this time of new beginning, this new phase of the year, that this is a transitional time, and that transitions, both in time and in place, are always fraught with danger because things are in flux, boundaries are down. As you move from one state to another, your defenses may be lowest. And so it's a particularly important time to sort of recollect, reconnect, and to then purify and protect. There's no end of sort of protective customs at this time. There's a an offering again to the wolves in Scotland, I think, of a bannock, an oat cake at this time. The list goes on and on. The last of these 4 fire festivals, I've already mentioned a second ago, it's Lunasa. You'll see it spelled different ways. It's often spelled Lughnasadh. The modern Irish spelling is Lunasa. You'll see other spellings as well. In Christian tradition and to a large degree in modern pagan, particularly Wiccan tradition, you'll see this holiday referred to as Lammas, Lammas, which refers to loaf mass. It comes from, I think, an old English word, hlafmassa, Hlaf, I think M-A-S or M-A-S-S-E, I forget the exact spelling, but that first part of it, Hlaf, refers to loaf. So you get a sense there. If it's loaf, it's bread, and perhaps the harvest. And this is indeed part of a complex of seasonal observances that have to do with the harvest. In English culture, you'll also see some of the customs associated with the autumn equinox. So there's a whole complex that takes place over late summer and the onset of fall that have to do with harvest customs. And some of these are associated with Lunasa. But one of the most interesting and enduring features of Lunasa was an association with athletics. It's sometimes referred to as the Gaelic Olympics. Customarily, there was a 14-day, a fortnight of games at the village of Telltown, which was one of any number of observances involving athletics at this time, but that was certainly the most famous. Among other athletic events, horse racing would be very common at this time, down into modern times. Telltown, as a major site associated with a festival named Lunasa, is a very interesting part of the picture of this festival. Because Lunasa, it's assumed, and there's good reason to assume that, was probably a festival associated with the god Lu, or Lu. You'll see spelled L-U-G-H, sometimes L-U-G. We think that's where the name comes from. Lu, in at least one myth, had as a foster mother who taught him a sort of earth goddess named Teltu, T-A-I-L-L-T-I-U. Teltu was part of a race of beings that was in Ireland before the gods, before the Tuatha Danann, who I've mentioned a couple times. And Lu, who was a young, multi-talented god, was fostered to Teltu for training. It's said that Teltu was responsible for the clearings of various fields, so there's an agricultural association to her, hence, among a couple of other reasons, an association with her as being an earth goddess, and that as part of her labors, she perished. And one version of the tale says that Lu decreed a funeral festival for her, and that these games that survived down into modern times at Telltown were originally dedicated by the god Lu to his foster mother, the earth goddess Teltu. So that, along with harvest customs, is a major focus of Lunasa's sort of association with athletic endeavors. Now, if Samhain and Beltane sort of stand in a certain kind of relationship to each other as major hinge points, passage from light to dark, dark to light during the year, I don't think it's unreasonable to look at whether there are ways in which Imbolc and Lunasa stand in relationship to each other. And I hate to fall into gender stereotypes, but if I indulge myself that for a minute, you certainly can look at Imbolc as having an awful lot of feminine associations. regardless of whether you see the tending of the hearth as being a specifically feminine endeavor. And to be honest, in ancient Indo-European traditions, often it is a young woman, often a virgin, very frequently, and this is true in Celtic societies, the youngest girl of the house who has responsibility for tending the fire. Recall the Vestal Virgins in Rome, cult of virgin priestesses who tended the important sacred fire that was the hearth fire for the whole empire. So in addition to some of the motherhood and nurturing associations around Imbolc, you also have this notion that, there are hearth customs, and that was in fact associated, at least in times of old, with young women or girls. Lunasa has strong associations with athletics and outdoor competitions and things of that nature, the harvest and so forth. So maybe that's all just a reflection of the fact that one happens in part of the coldest times of the year, and the other happens at the height of summer, perhaps the warmest part of the year. So one's a good time for associations with indoor practices, and another is a good time for association with outdoor endeavors. But also maybe it's okay to to attach some gender stereotypes to those and look at one as having strong feminine associations, and the other, Lunasa, having strong masculine associations. I've already mentioned in passing, this is the last point I wanted to raise about this festival, that the contracting of marriage at Lunasa was really common. The last comment I want to make is just to sort of touch on once again, and maybe flesh out for just a second, the appropriation of the names of these fire festivals by modern pagan traditions. There's a lot of talk on the internet and elsewhere about whether the use of, say, Irish fire festival names for 4 of the Sabbats of modern Wicca is in some sense disrespectful to Irish culture, or to Scottish culture, or, to any of the Celtic nations. And that's always struck me as a little bit funny. I mean, I understand the reasoning that it's like non-Native Americans wanting to practice Native American religion, whether or not they actually are sort of trained and initiated by Native Americans who do hold the tradition. There is a sense of, is somebody being a wannabe? Are they diluting, watering down, perverting, distorting, spreading disinformation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm not sure I see how that would be the case by the use of these words. They are words that do refer to certain points in the year. There are certain attributes, certain associations in the history of these occasions and the folklore around these occasions, which do reinforce and in fact have been the source for some of the modern Wiccan and other pagan associations with the festivals. I've already mentioned in passing Samhain as a time when the veil between the worlds is thin, and the way in which we do find the intrusions of otherworldly entities at that time. Certainly Imbolc was in fact a festival associated with, well, certainly it is the festival of the Saint Bridget, and we have every reason to assume that it was in times past associated with a goddess Bridget. And so honoring motherhood, fertility, feminine attributes like that at that festival is certainly in keeping with a demonstrable tradition that's associated with that festival. And the same can be said in different ways for Beltane and for Lunasa. And I think the important thing is that the use of these terms by modern pagans who may or may not really be interested in exploring Celtic culture at least be a catalyst for reminding people or encouraging people to consider the fact that these terms do come from somewhere. They do come from an authentic cultural lineage. They do reflect an ethnic heritage, if you will, or more than one ethnic heritage. And that some of these are actually the current names for months in the calendar of some of these living albeit fragile, ethnic communities. And with that, I'll conclude.